This happened when I was 13, and it's still one of the scariest experiences of my life. It all unfolded on a summer night in the busy city neighborhood where I grew up. The streets were always bustling, and I felt safe walking around to parks or friends' houses. My best friend at the time was Daniel, who lived just a few blocks away. We spent most of our free time together, either hanging out at each other's homes or shooting hoops at the nearby basketball courts. Every summer, our city hosted a carnival, a big event that drew people from neighboring towns. It had everything: games, rides, food, and lots of attractions. The carnival was only about a 20-minute walk from where we lived, so it was a regular summer tradition for us to go. One Friday, Daniel and I decided to head there after school. Our parents trusted us enough to let us go on our own since we were old enough to handle ourselves. It was about a 30-minute walk from school because the carnival was in the opposite direction of our houses, but we didn't mind. By the time we arrived, the place was buzzing with activity. Bright lights, laughter, and the smell of funnel cakes and popcorn in the air. We spent hours enjoying the games and attractions, trying to win prizes like oversized stuffed animals and sports jerseys. We were both competitive, which made it even more fun. After we had been there for a while, a man approached us out of nowhere. He was older, with graying hair and a mustache, and had a strange energy about him. "How's it going, boys?" he asked, his tone friendly but off-putting. We gave polite but brief answers, unsure of what he wanted. Then he asked if we needed more tickets, saying he could get us some. Neither of us needed tickets, and we both felt uneasy around him, so we declined. He lingered for a moment before walking away. Daniel and I didn't think much of it and went back to playing games. About an hour later, though, the man reappeared. This time, he asked how much longer we were planning to stay and where we were going afterward. The questions made us uncomfortable, so we answered vaguely and quickly walked away. As we blended back into the crowd, we talked about how creepy he seemed but tried to laugh it off. The carnival was fun, and we didn't want some random guy to ruin it for us. Eventually, though, we decided it was time to head home. The plan was to walk together most of the way and then split off when we got close to our houses. The further we walked from the carnival, the darker and quieter the streets became. About 5 minutes into the walk, we heard footsteps behind us. I glanced back and saw the same man following us at a short distance. My stomach dropped. "Is that him?" Daniel asked, his voice low. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep calm. We picked up our pace, hoping he'd lose interest, but when we turned onto another street, he made the same turn. It was darker now, with fewer streetlights and no one else around. The man's footsteps remained steady behind us. At this point, there was no denying he was following us. We whispered about what to do and decided to keep walking until we reached the spot where Daniel and I would split off. When we got there, we made a plan. We'd both run to our houses in opposite directions. That way, the man couldn't follow us both. As soon as we split, I heard Daniel take off down his street, but the man didn't chase him. Instead, he came after me. My heart raced as I sprinted toward home. When I glanced over my shoulder, he was running too, closing the distance fast. I veered off the sidewalk, cutting through a neighbor's yard and jumping over a fence. I thought maybe that would slow him down, but to my horror, I heard him follow. I was panicking now, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I ran through the backyard, darting past a garden and out onto another street. I looked back again and couldn't see him anymore, but I wasn't taking any chances. I kept running, weaving through yards and side streets, until I finally reached my house. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with my keys, but I managed to unlock the door and slam it shut behind me. My mom, startled by the noise, came into the hallway and saw me panting and wide-eyed. "What happened?" she asked. Between breaths, I told her everything. She immediately called the police while I peeked out the window, half expecting to see the man lurking nearby. But he was gone. The police arrived shortly after and took my statement. They searched the neighborhood but couldn't find him. They also went to Daniel's house to make sure he was safe, and thankfully he was. We both stayed inside for the rest of the night, shaken but relieved that nothing worse had happened. After that, I was terrified to go anywhere alone. I used to walk to school every day, but my parents insisted on driving me for a while after the incident. Even now, years later, I haven't forgotten how it felt to be chased like that. I never saw the man again, and nothing similar has happened since. But whenever I think about that summer night, I can still hear his footsteps behind me, and I feel that same cold knot of fear in my chest. It was a cold and quiet evening when my family left for their trip. I waved goodbye, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. I'd have the whole house to myself for the weekend. I had plans to binge-watch my favorite TV shows and indulge in some junk food. At first, the idea of being alone didn't scare me, but as night fell, a strange feeling crept in. The house felt too quiet. Every creak of the old wood seemed louder and more unsettling. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was all in my head. I settled onto the couch with a bowl of popcorn and turned on the TV. The flickering light from the screen cast eerie shadows on the walls. After a while, I heard a noise coming from the kitchen, like a soft tap. I paused the TV and listened, but the sound had stopped. I shrugged, assuming it was just the house settling. Turning back to my show, I tried to lose myself in the story. But then, I heard it again. This time, it was louder and more insistent. Not just a tap, but a knock. My heart started to race. I got up and slowly made my way to the kitchen. Peeking around the corner, everything seemed normal. The doors and windows were all shut. I let out a sigh of relief and turned to go back to the living room. That's when I saw him. A man was standing outside the kitchen window, staring at me. His face was pale, and his eyes were wild and wide. He had a scruffy beard and wore dirty, tattered clothes. My blood ran cold. I stood frozen, unable to move or speak. He raised his hand and knocked on the window again, harder this time. Snapping out of my daze, I backed away, my mind racing. I had to do something. Grabbing my phone, I dialed 911 with trembling fingers. "What's your emergency?" the operator's calm voice asked. There's a man outside my window," I whispered, afraid he might hear me. "He's trying to get in." "Stay on the line," she said. "Help is on the way. Can you lock yourself in a room?" I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Yes, I can." I ran upstairs and locked myself in my bedroom. I sat on the floor with my back against the door, trying to stay calm. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. The operator kept talking, reassuring me that the police were on their way. Suddenly, there was a loud crash. He had broken the window. He was inside the house. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. I could hear his footsteps on the stairs, coming closer. "He's in the house?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "Stay quiet and don't move," she replied. "The police are almost there." I heard him trying the doors one by one. When he got to my bedroom door, he started banging on it, trying to break it down. I pressed harder against the door, praying it would hold. Those minutes felt like an eternity. The banging grew louder and more desperate. Just when I thought the door would give way, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The man must have heard them too, because the banging suddenly stopped. Everything went silent. I strained to listen and heard the sound of running footsteps, then the front door slamming shut. He was trying to escape. A few moments later, I heard voices downstairs. The police had arrived. "It's okay. The police are here," the operator said. "You can open the door now." I slowly unlocked the door and stepped out. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. I made my way downstairs, where 2 officers were waiting. They looked at me with concern. "Are you all right?" one of them asked. I nodded, still in shock. "He broke in through the window," I said, my voice quivering. "We've got him," the other officer reassured me. "He's in custody now. You're safe." A wave of relief washed over me. The nightmare was over. The officers stayed with me until my parents came home, making sure I was okay. I told them everything, and they assured me the man would be taken care of. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face at the window. But I was grateful that it was over and that I was safe. The police later informed us that the man was a drifter with a history of break-ins. He had been caught before but always managed to escape. This time, they promised he wouldn't get away. Since that night, I've made sure to double-check all the doors and windows before going to bed. I even had a security system installed. The experience shook me to my core, but it also taught me to be more cautious. Before we dive into the next story, if you're here for the first time, let me know where you're tuning in from. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any of the upcoming scary stories. We appreciate your support. Feel free to share these stories with your friends and family. It was a dark and stormy night, the kind where the wind howled like a ghost's wail and rain poured down in thick sheets, making the road ahead nearly impossible to see. I was sitting in the back seat of our old, reliable car, and my mom was driving. We were on our way home after visiting Grandma. The trip had been long, and I was exhausted. My eyelids felt heavy, and I could feel myself starting to drift off to sleep. Suddenly, the car came to a screeching stop, jolting me awake. I was thrown forward, my seatbelt digging into my chest. I looked up to see a man standing in the middle of the road. He was soaked from the rain, and his clothes were torn and dirty. His face was hidden in the shadows, but his eyes were visible. They were wild and terrified, like the eyes of an animal trapped with no escape. My mom gasped, quickly locking the car doors. She kept her foot pressed on the brake, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. We both stared at the man, unsure of what to do. He looked desperate, but there was something about him that made me uneasy. My heart pounded in my chest, and a feeling of dread crawled up my spine. Before we could react, 3 more men appeared from the shadows. They seemed to materialize out of nowhere, like ghosts in the darkness. They surrounded the car, banging on the windows and pulling at the door handles. My mom screamed, and I could see the panic in her eyes. "Lock the doors," she shouted. "Keep them locked." I fumbled to obey, my hands trembling as I secured my door lock. I was so scared that I could hardly breathe. The men were yelling, but the rain and closed windows muffled their voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I knew it couldn't be good. One of them had a crowbar and started smashing it against the driver's side window. The glass held, but small cracks began to spread across it. My mom's eyes widened with fear, and I realized that we were running out of time. "Hold on tight," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm getting us out of here." She floored the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward. The man with the crowbar barely jumped back in time, just missing the car. The others scattered, shouting angrily as we sped away on the rain-slicked road. The car skidded and swerved, but my mom kept it under control. She drove as fast as she could, her eyes fixed straight ahead. I turned around to see the men shrinking in the distance. My heart was still pounding, and I felt like I couldn't catch my breath. "Are you okay?" my mom asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. I nodded, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. I was too terrified. My mom reached back and grabbed my hand, her grip firm yet still trembling. "We're safe now," she said. "It's okay. We're safe." We drove in silence for a while, the only sounds being the rain pounding on the roof and the engine humming. My mind was racing with questions. Who were those men? What did they want? Why were they trying to get into our car? As we got closer to our neighborhood, the rain started to let up, and the storm began to pass. The sky was still dark, but I could see the faint glow of streetlights ahead. I began to relax slightly, the tension in my body slowly fading. When we finally pulled into our driveway, my mom parked the car and turned off the engine. She exhaled a deep breath and looked at me. "Always lock your doors," she said. "No matter where you are or how safe you think it is, always lock your doors." I nodded again, fully understanding her warning. That night had been a terrifying reminder of how quickly things could take a turn for the worse. It was a lesson we would never forget. As we stepped into the house, my mom put her arm around my shoulders, pulling me close. The warmth and safety of home felt like a thick blanket, wrapping around us. We were home and we were safe, that was all that mattered. We didn't talk much about what had happened that night, but the memory stayed with us. It was a sobering reminder to always be careful, to always be aware of our surroundings, and to always lock the doors. It was a hard-earned lesson, but one that would keep us safe in the future. I arrived at a rundown motel on What Avenue in Sacramento late one evening, exhausted after a long day on the road. The motel looked just as shabby and worn out as the online reviews had warned. But it was cheap and I was too tired to care. I checked in, got my room key, and dragged my heavy suitcase to room number 12, hoping to get a few hours of rest. The room was worse than I had imagined. The wallpaper was peeling off the walls, and the smell of mildew hung in the air. The bed, with its sagging mattress and thin, worn-out sheets, didn't look inviting at all. I dropped my bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, hearing the springs creak beneath me. As I sat there, I felt an itch on my arm. I scratched it, but then I felt another itch on my leg. Looking closely, I saw tiny reddish-brown bugs crawling on the bedspread. Bed bugs. Just my luck. There was no way I could sleep on that bed now. I glanced around the room for another option and spotted the small, grimy bathroom. The bathtub, though not exactly clean, seemed like a better alternative than the bug-infested bed. I grabbed a spare blanket from my suitcase and laid it out in the tub. The hard surface was uncomfortable, but at least I wouldn't get bitten by bugs. I lay down in the bathtub, pulling my jacket over me for warmth. The hard surface made it difficult to sleep, but exhaustion eventually won, and I drifted into a restless slumber. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up with a start. First, I couldn't figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from the main room. My heart started pounding in my chest. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or maybe a stray animal. But then I heard a louder noise, like someone bumping into a piece of furniture. There was no mistaking it now. Someone was in my room. I quietly reached for my small pocket knife, the only weapon I had. My hands shook as I unfolded the blade, gripping it tightly. I slowly climbed out of the bathtub, careful not to make a sound, and crept toward the door, peeking through the small crack. In the dim glow from the streetlight outside, I saw a shadow rifling through my suitcase. My blood ran cold. An intruder was rummaging through my belongings. I had to do something, but I was terrified. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped into the room. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. The figure froze and turned to face me. It was a tall, gaunt man with scruffy facial hair and wild eyes. He looked just as startled as I was. We stood there, staring at each other, neither of us moving. Finally, he broke the silence. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said, his voice shaky. "I thought this room was empty." I tightened my grip on the knife. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, my voice trembling. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I'm sorry," he said. "I was just looking for a place to sleep. I saw the window was unlocked and figured I could crash here for the night. I didn't know anyone was staying." My mind raced. He didn't seem dangerous, but I couldn't be sure. "You need to leave now," I said firmly, trying to hide my fear. The man nodded slowly. Okay, I'm going," he said. "I didn't take anything, I swear." He took a step toward the door but paused, looking back at me. "You should lock your window. It's not safe around here." I watched him carefully as he slipped out the door and disappeared into the night. As soon as he was gone, I locked the door and shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. My heart was still pounding, but I felt a small sense of relief. I sat down on the floor, my back against the wall, trying to calm myself. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in. I had narrowly avoided a potentially dangerous situation, but thankfully, it hadn't turned violent. Looking around the dingy room, I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I quickly packed up my things, double-checking to make sure I hadn't left anything behind. The itch on my arm reminded me of the bed bugs, and I shuddered at the thought. As I left the motel, I made sure to lock the car door securely. The sky was beginning to lighten, signaling the first hints of dawn, and I decided to drive to a nearby diner. I needed a strong cup of coffee and some time to gather my thoughts. Sitting in the diner, surrounded by the early morning chatter, I reflected on everything that had happened. It had been a terrifying experience, but I had made it through. The intruder's final words echoed in my mind. This place isn't safe. One thing was certain, I would be much more careful about where I chose to stay from now on, and I would always lock the window. Starting a new job always brings a mix of excitement and nerves. That's exactly how I felt when I landed a summer gig at a local carnival in downtown Los Angeles. My goal was simple: make some extra cash before heading into my senior year of college in the fall. The carnival was typical, packed with games, food stalls, and one big attraction, the funhouse. During the day, it was a family-friendly maze of mirrors and obstacles. But at night, it turned into a haunted house. Unlike flimsy tent setups, this funhouse was an actual building, solid and imposing, rumored to have once been a wealthy man's mansion. My job? Manage the funhouse, which was easily the most popular spot in the carnival. At first glance, the job seemed simple enough. Make sure people got in, had fun, and made it out safely. For the first couple of days, everything went smoothly. Then, strange things started happening. At first, it was little inconsistencies. I count 12 people entering, but only 11 would exit. I brushed it off, assuming I'd miscounted amid the chaos of laughter and screams. But then it kept happening. 7 people entered, 6 came out. 10 went in, 9 exited. It wasn't adding up. Was I making mistakes? Or was something actually wrong? One busy afternoon, a girl caught my eye as she approached the funhouse. She was stunning, easily the most out-of-place person in the sea of families and kids. She looked around my age, maybe a little older. I couldn't help but stare for a moment. She smiled at me, handed over her ticket, and I directed her inside. I kept working, glancing back at the entrance every now and then, hoping I'd catch her on her way out, so I could maybe work up the nerve to talk to her. But as time went on, I noticed something strange. Groups that had entered after her were already coming out, yet she was nowhere to be seen. A few more minutes passed, and my unease grew. She should have been out by now. Concerned, I decided to step away from my post and check inside. I locked the entrance behind me and ventured into the maze of dimly lit hallways and mirrored rooms. Everything seemed normal at first, until I noticed something peculiar. A faint seam in one of the walls. It looked like part of the design, but something about it felt off. I pressed on it, and to my surprise, it clicked open, revealing a hidden door and a pitch-black corridor beyond. My heart raced. What was this? I stepped inside, using my phone's flashlight to navigate. The corridor was narrow and damp, and it didn't feel like it belonged to the funhouse. I reached another door at the end of the passage, opened it cautiously, and found myself back outside, on the carnival grounds. Relief washed over me. Maybe those missing people had found this secret exit by accident and left without telling anyone. I started heading back to my post, but something nagged at me. I wasn't ready to give up. I felt like I needed to keep exploring. Maybe it was the mystery of it all, or maybe I just wanted to delay going back to work. Either way, I found another seam in the wall similar to the first one. Once again, I pressed it, and it opened. This time, though, the air changed. A foul smell hit me immediately, and instead of another hallway, there was a ladder leading downward. My mind raced. I had been told the building didn't have a basement. Against every instinct, I climbed down, the smell growing stronger with each step. At the bottom, I found something that didn't belong in any carnival. It was a long, dark tunnel that seemed to stretch endlessly. I froze, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The rational part of me screamed to go back, but curiosity pulled me forward. The walls were damp, and the air was heavy with silence. As I moved further, my flashlight caught something. A small, glittery white purse lying in the middle of the path. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It looked familiar. Then it hit me, it was hers, the girl from earlier. My chest tightened. Was she down here? Why hadn't she come back up? Panic set in. I shouted into the tunnel, calling her name, but there was no response. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard footsteps echoing in the darkness. My blood ran cold. Whoever or whatever was coming, I didn't want to find out. I spun around and sprinted back toward the ladder. Halfway up, I slipped and fell hard, the footsteps closing in. My heart was pounding as I braced myself for the worst. Then I heard a voice, a girl's voice, hers. She was clutching her side, her face pale as she gasped, "Help me!" Relief flooded over me. I urged her to climb the ladder, but she grabbed my arm and begged me to follow her deeper into the tunnel. Something about her tone sent chills down my spine. I refused and practically dragged her up the ladder. Once we were back on the ground floor, I slammed the hidden door shut. I asked her what had happened, but she couldn't give a straight answer. She kept muttering about hearing voices and feeling like something was following her. When I asked why she wanted me to stay down there, she just stared at me with these vacant, almost lifeless eyes. I didn't press further. I called the police, but before they arrived, she slipped away. I never saw her again. When the police investigated, they discovered something unbelievable. The building had been a Prohibition-era safe house in the 1920s, with secret passageways leading to an underground tunnel system. Some of the tunnels had never been fully mapped. The carnival's owner claimed he had no idea, but I wasn't convinced. I quit the job the next day. Even now, I'm haunted by unanswered questions. Did the owner know about the tunnels? Was that girl almost abducted? Or was she involved in something sinister herself? I'll never know, but every possibility is equally terrifying. I hate carnivals. Always have, probably always will. To me, they're nothing but chaotic, overcrowded places filled with screaming kids, greasy food, and that unbearable mix of sugary and sweaty smells. I'm not sure where my hatred started, but it definitely intensified after what happened a few years ago. My little sister had begged me to take her to a local carnival, and despite my better judgment, I gave in. I didn't want to seem rude, so I reluctantly agreed to go, even though I knew I'd hate every second of it. After an hour or so, my sister got bored and wanted to leave. I called my mom to pick her up, but I wasn't ready to head home just yet. I was in the middle of an argument with my dad and didn't want to deal with him until he'd gone to bed. I told my mom I'd walk home later, so she came, picked up my sister, and left me behind. The carnival, though, was honestly depressing that night. The crowd was thin, and everyone seemed miserable. Still, since I'd paid for my ticket, I figured I might as well try to get my money's worth. Wandering aimlessly, I decided to check out the funhouse. Maybe it would at least give me something to do. When I stepped inside, though, it was dead silent. No kids laughing, no people shouting, just me. The eerie quiet made me realize how much the atmosphere of a funhouse depends on the sounds of other people. Without them, it felt more like stepping into a ghost town filled with distorted mirrors. The emptiness gave me a weird feeling, but I tried to shake it off. At first, I managed to distract myself with the mirrors. Some of the warped reflections made me laugh a little. But then, about halfway through, I noticed something that wiped the smile off my face. Out of the corner of my eye, in one of the mirrors, I saw a face. A bald man with sunken eyes, staring directly at me. I froze. The image was there for just a second, but it was enough to freak me out. I spun around trying to find him, but no one was there. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. The mirrors could play tricks on your mind, after all. Still, the feeling of unease lingered as I moved through the maze. Then, I saw him again, this time reflected in another mirror. He was grinning now, a wild, unsettling grin. My heart started racing. I yelled out, "Who's there?" but got no response. The silence only made it creepier. I picked up my pace, my eyes darting around for any sign of him. The mirrors made it impossible to tell where he was, or if he was even real. I kept running into dead ends, and the disorientation only added to my growing panic. Suddenly, as I turned a corner, a hand shot out from behind one of the mirrors and grabbed my wrist. I screamed and instinctively started thrashing, trying to pull free. The grip was strong, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I wouldn't be able to break loose. I lashed out, punching the arm holding me, and after a few hits, the hand let go. Scrambling to my feet, I finally got a good look at him. He was wearing gray clothes, had a slight gut, and his face looked exhausted, almost hollow. I didn't wait for him to make another move. I bolted. My adrenaline kicked in, and somehow, I managed to navigate my way back to the entrance. I burst through the doors, gasping for air, but just as I started to feel safe, I realized something terrible. I didn't have my wallet. I must have dropped it when I fell. There was no way I was going back in. Instead, I ran to the nearest staff member and told her everything. She looked confused and told me the funhouse had been closed to visitors that night. Her words hit me like a punch in the gut. A chill ran down my spine. The staff called the police, and they searched the funhouse, but they didn't find anything. Not even my wallet. The cops dismissed my story, saying it was probably just a prank or that I'd imagined it. Frustrated and embarrassed, I walked home, trying to convince myself it was over. But it wasn't. A week later, my girlfriend called me in a panic. She was practically screaming into the phone, telling me about something horrifying that had just happened. Someone had been texting her, pretending to be me, and convinced her to drive to a remote spot, supposedly to help me fix a flat tire. Luckily, she brought her dad with her, even though the person texting her had insisted she come alone. When they arrived, they realized something was wrong. The car parked at the location didn't match mine, and before they could react, 6 men got out of the vehicle. Her dad immediately jumped back in the car, and they sped off before the men could reach them. That's when everything clicked. I had written down my girlfriend's phone number on a slip of paper that was in my wallet. Whoever had grabbed it now had her number. It was a terrifying realization. After that incident, we changed all our contact information, our phone numbers, even our emails, and for the past month, nothing else has happened. But the memory of that night in the funhouse still haunts me. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I can't shake the thought of how much worse things could have turned out. So yeah, I hate carnivals, and now you probably understand why. When I was 12, I went to a carnival that had come to town. It was the kind of place that could overwhelm your senses. Flashing lights, lively music, and the sweet aroma of popcorn and cotton candy filling the air. I loved everything about it. The thrilling rides, quirky booths, and even the odd little sideshows. But one particular night, something happened that I'll never forget. Even now, thinking about it sends chills down my spine. The carnival was packed with people. My friends and I had wandered in together, but they were busy playing ring toss, which didn't interest me. I wanted to find something different, something unique. That's when I noticed a small fortune teller's tent tucked away in a dark corner of the carnival. It was easy to miss, overshadowed by the bigger attractions, but something about it drew me in. The sign outside read, "Know your future. The all-seeing eye awaits you." It felt mysterious, almost otherworldly, and I couldn't resist the pull to step inside. I pushed aside the heavy curtain at the entrance and entered. The air inside was thick with the smoky scent of incense, making it slightly hard to breathe. A dim lamp cast flickering shadows across the canvas walls, and in the center of the room sat an older man at a small round table. He looked like he had stepped out of another time, his silver hair and long beard giving him a wise, almost mystical appearance. His dark robe flowed loosely around him, and his hands, adorned with glittering rings, moved slowly as he gestured for me to sit. "Come in, young one," he said in a deep, calm voice, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach flip. "I've been expecting you." His words sent a shiver down my spine. How could he have been expecting me? I hadn't even planned on visiting his tent until moments ago. Still, I told myself it was just part of his act, so I sat down across from him, trying not to look as nervous as I felt. "Tell me," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "What is it you wish to know?" I hesitated for a moment before finally replying, "I want to know about my future." He nodded slowly, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. For a moment, The tent was completely silent except for the faint sound of the wind rustling the canvas outside. When he finally spoke again, his voice was heavier, more serious. "I see many things in your future," he began. "There will be joys and sorrows, triumphs and trials. But," he paused, his brow furrowing, "there is one thing you must be warned about. There is a shadow in your future. A figure who will follow you, no matter where you go. You can run, you can hide, but they will always be there, just behind you. You cannot escape them." My heart began to race. His words felt unervingly specific, too personal to brush off as a generic fortune. I wanted to laugh, to say it was all just for show, but the way he looked at me made that impossible. "How do you know this?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. He opened his eyes and fixed me with a piercing stare. "I know many things," he said softly. Then, leaning in closer, he added, "Be careful when you leave this place. The shadow will be waiting." I didn't know how to respond. I stood up quickly, muttering a shaky, "Thanks for the warning," before rushing out of the tent. Outside, the carnival no longer felt fun or lively. The colorful lights seemed dimmer, the music quieter, and the laughter around me felt hollow. The fortune teller's words echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. As I walked away from the tent, I noticed a man standing near one of the food stands. He was wearing a long coat and a hat that cast a shadow over his face. At first, I thought he was just another carnival goer, but something about the way he stood there, completely still, sent a wave of unease through me. I tried to ignore him and walked toward the rides, but when I glanced back, he was still there, watching me. My stomach twisted with fear. I told myself it was just a coincidence, some trick to scare me that the fortune teller had set up. But that explanation didn't make me feel any better. Deciding I'd had enough, I left the carnival and started walking home. It was late, and the streets were mostly empty. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man again. Sure enough, he was there, following me. He stayed at a distance, but his presence was unmistakable. I tried to stay calm, telling myself he was probably just heading in the same direction. But when I quickened my pace, so did he. My heart pounded harder with each step. Finally, I saw my house up ahead, its porch light glowing faintly in the dark. Relief flooded me, and I broke into a run. The man's footsteps grew louder behind me, faster, more deliberate. I reached my front door and fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Just as I managed to unlock the door, I glanced back. The man was standing at the end of my driveway, completely still. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel his gaze, cold and unrelenting. I threw the door open and slammed it shut behind me, locking it quickly. My chest heaved as I pressed my back against the door, listening for his footsteps. But there was nothing, just silence. I never saw the man again after that night, but the memory of him, and the fortune teller's warning, still haunts me. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching me, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reappear.